Okay, hi, welcome. In this video, this is just a few short things about our assignment 3 for my class. I mean, hopefully most of you figured this out already, but I want to make the video anyway, just to have it for the future in any case. But I had a couple people asking about, how I gave 3 files in this assignment 3. So a large integer.cpp, and a large integer.hpp, which is a header file, and then an assignment.cpp file that contains the main function. Okay, I had a couple students asking about it, I wanted to discuss a few things about that anyway. So, like I said, just to show how you set up like a multi-file project like that, and a few other things that I wanted to mention for you all. So I'll show this both in Visual Studio, and I've got Dev C++ now. So another thing I might do in this video is just show 1 or 2 things about Dev C++ that I figured out, and I just recently posted a comment about those as well. But anyway, if let's see here. I might already have created a project by this name, but let me just try. So, I mean, in Visual Studio, so for all IDEs, usually they have a notion of a project. So a project is just something that collects files together that need to be built, maybe linked together, to create the product of that project. So usually an executable or something like that, right? So as usual, I'm just going to use an empty project. We'll call it assignment 3 here for Visual Studio. So the normal way that I create a multi-file project in Visual Studio or any IDE is you have to find out how the IDE represents a project, and then you have to add the files to the correct place in the project. So Visual Studio is a little bit more complex than some IDEs, so it breaks your project down into multiple sub areas, and it actually uses different folders on your desktop for all these projects. So I mean, what you need for this assignment 3, you need to add 2 source files. So two C++ files. So one for that holds the main, and one that holds the large header the large integer.cpp file, right? So I'll just create those. So I'm creating these empty, and I'm just going to copy that initial template code I gave you into here. So I'll go ahead and do that. So let's copy assignment 3 into here. The starting template I gave for you. So I'm sure there's probably even a better way to do this. You can probably download the file and put it in the right directory, and then just add the file to Visual Studio. So it's probably better than what I'm doing here. But I'll do this. So I just created the files empty, and then I just copy and paste that template code I gave you. So there was assignment 3, which basically has a relatively big main here, about 100 lines of testing code. But that's the only thing in main here for assignment 3. Notice, so it doesn't actually have anything else. So let's get the large integer.cpp code as well. Maybe I'll come back and describe these real quickly, but so that, and then you also need a header file. So for Visual Studio, you have to add header files, or you should add header files to the header directory here. I think, I could be wrong, but I think basically anything you say is a source file, it's going to try and compile that and link it together. But anything you say is a header file, it doesn't try to compile it, but it makes certain that it's in the path, so if you include it somewhere, it can find it. Okay, so some C++ people just use .h, even though it's a C++ header. Some people use HPP to indicate that it's really C++ code and not vanilla C code. So I usually use HPP for a C++ header file. So again, it's the same thing. I right-click on that and say Add a new item, but we want to add a header file. But I'm gonna name it large integer.hpp. So should probably use the same name. So again, I'm I must not have created this as an empty project. Did I mess that up? So whenever you see these, you might not have created your project as an empty project here. Well, I could be wrong. So maybe it's trying to use that's those pragmas are not a standard C++ thing. They're a Visual Studio kind of thing in order to do it. So I'll show you here. So so in order to avoid multiple includes of header files, you'll often see this little bit of boilerplate in header files that people create for C or C++ programs. So if some value is not defined, and you usually use the name of the file, but all in uppercase letters, and maybe I could change that to HPP, but that's fine. So if that's not defined, then you define it. So if it's not defined, then you'll define it, and you'll actually load all this code here. If it is defined, it just skips over this. So the practical effect is, since once it gets defined, that means it's been loaded once, and the second time somebody tries to include this file, it'll skip over all this, and it won't include it again. If in C++, when you do one of these include statements, it just goes in. An include statement basically just copies the code in the file that you specify here. So it's as if I had copy and pasted the code from IOStream, or copy and pasted the code from largeinteger.hpp right here, and replace that include statement with a copy of the code. That's what the include actually does. Okay, but if you have an include is multiple times, so if you're doing a multi-file project like this, I might include HPP in another file, and we actually do. We include that also in the largeinteger.cpp. So if you have multiple includes like this, you're going to end up with multiple declaration errors, unless you make certain that you don't include your declared stuff more than once. And I believe that's what the number pragmas do in Visual Studio, but that's really a Visual Studio specific thing. So this is the portable way of doing that, of making sure you don't include statements multiple times, okay? So anyway, just a little bit about header files and CPP files. So if you've never worked in a multi-file project like this, the convention is, and we're going to follow this in class, I'm going to force you to follow it in this class so you learn kind of the convention. So you always put your declarations in header files, okay? So if I'm building a class or an abstract data type or something like that, and that's the kind of thing that we're trying to teach you in this class here, the only thing that should go in your header file is just like your class declaration. And typically your class like if you're building a class, your class declaration is just going to declare what the member variables are of your class, and those will usually be private, and it will declare the public and private member functions of your class. And notice we don't have the implementation of the class, so we don't actually have the code of these member functions. So we don't actually have the code to implement. In this case, for project 3, assignment 3, I gave you code for a constructor and a destructor for the large integer class, but you don't have the implementations in the header file. This is really just the function prototype again. So if I want to call my constructor, it basically just takes one parameter as input. This particular constructor, it takes an integer as its one and only parameter, okay? So then when you're doing headers like this, the corresponding CPP file actually contains the implementation for any member functions or any function prototypes that you give in the header file, okay? So I gave you, for the beginning for assignment 3, since I had two function prototypes, the constructor and the destructor, I actually have implementations of those. So there's an example implementation of the constructor for the large integer class. Okay, I gave you this mostly because just to make certain you had an example of how you should do dynamic memory allocation to create this digits array, okay? And I actually also have the destructor. The destructor is actually displaying a little log message on standard output, and that's about all it does, okay? So anyway, that's the basics of it. So if I did everything right, you should be able to. So now I have the code in 3 different files. But what C++ will do or so what Visual Studio will do is it will compile these two files separately into what are known as object files, and then it will link those together into your final executable. Okay, so let's do build, Control-Shift-B. Let's pay a little bit more attention than usual to these output messages. So what you should see is the, I had a warning there, I probably should have fixed that in the code that I gave you, but it compiled it. Yeah, so it didn't show you the individually compiling the two .cpp files. So yeah, so I believe it did compile these two files separately and then linked it together. It just didn't display what it was doing there, which kind of a little bit bad. But anyway, let's see if that actually ran. So again, if you had that right, every time I give you starting templates for the class, they should compile and run before you actually add any code. So so yeah, if we go to our main here and we set a breakpoint at the end, like usual for Visual Studio, and actually run it, it should run and it'll print out some things. So again, as usual, it's not really doing much. It is actually constructing one object at the large integer object at the top, large integer 1, li1, and then so you notice that it constructs it, and then you notice at the end that it actually destructs. So you can actually two objects were getting created. So 1 and 2. So anyway, that's kind of a little something that you should discover for the project here as you're doing it. But that's the basics of how you set up a multi-file project in Visual Studio. Your source file's here and your header file here. Okay. So let me show you the same thing in Dev C++. Although before I do that, let me go over. So I mentioned this in my comments, but I guess okay. Well, no, I do have to maybe create a new project here first before I can show you some things. So again, for whatever IDE you're using, that should have a concept of a project, and Dev C++ concept of a project is much simpler than Visual Studio. So it just creates what is essentially a file that you tell it, where you tell it all of the files that are in your project. So if you do you should usually do a new project if you want a multi-file project. And again, use an empty project for projects for this particular class I'm doing these videos for. So I'll call it the project name assignment 3. So yeah, I mean, what Visual Studio does is create one of these dev files, and this is like, if you know what a make file is, I believe that this dev file is like a make file. So all it does is it saves whatever files you add to the projects and keeps information in there about which files are that you add to the project, and then how to compile them to link them together. So let's do that. So then, again, there might be a better way. So by default, when you create a project in Dev C++, it creates like an empty file, but doesn't give it a name. So I'm going to go ahead and rename that to be my assignment 3.cpp file. And again, I'll just copy and paste my assignment 3 starting template code into there. And then you can, yeah, so and you should probably save the file once you've done that. So, and like I did on Visual Studio, I'm just going to add a file to the project. So yeah, I guess that's probably how, if I was to actually download the files and just put them somewhere like in my documents, I could do a right click and add to project. But like I did for Visual Studio, I'll just create a new file, rename it to large integer.cpp. So this will hold the implementation file for our large integer class. Just paste all that starting template code in here and save it, and add one more file, rename it to large integer.hpp. And copy and paste in there and save that. Okay, so yeah, again, if I did everything correct, it should build and compile. So I remember, let me go ahead and build that here. So let's just compile it straight up. So you'll see the output messages are a little bit more detailed than Visual Studio. It doesn't. Dev C++ is a little bit more bare bones, but it doesn't hide things from you. So it's using the compiler. So you see it first compiles the assignment3.cpp file into an object file, and notice it does these -i's to be able to find files to include for those include statements. Including one should be. Anyway, and it compiles the large integer.cpp as the second thing it compiles into a .object file, and then this third line is it's actually linking them together. So the two object files get linked together, and the result is a file named assignment3.exe. That's your actual executable that was created there. Okay. And that's it. So, I mean, that was the basics of creating a multi-file project in Dev C++. So it compiled it correctly. It should be able to run it. So if I run it, again, you'll get the same results, or you should get the same results that I had in Visual Studio. So for the starting template code. Okay, and then while I'm here, kind of as a second thing on this video, I did post some hints on setting up Dev C++, since I've got at least half a dozen people in this class using this IDE. So so by default, the real stuff you want in order to get your formatting correct is this A style stuff, but by default it looks like this is not working. Okay, so you can get this working pretty easily. Just when you install Dev C++, don't install it into the default location, which goes to C:\program files. Instead, install it into a directory that you own. So I said in my comments that you should try installing it like into your users directory, so your home directory. So I installed it in users dash in my case. So if I look in my file browser and C:\users, my username on this machine is -dash, and I just installed it there. So now the install location was a folder devcpp on my home directory. If you do that, then these A-style tools work. Okay, but let me just show you kind of some of these other things. So if you want to set, without using the A style, if you want to set just the default indentation, you should do the tools editor options, and under general down here on tabs, for my class the correct settings are to uncheck this use tab characters. That'll force it to use spaces instead of tabs. It's probably useful to check this, so have tab automatically indents. But if you have that checked, it'll automatically indent 2 spaces instead of a tab every time you hit tab. And then set your tab size to 2, so it uses 2 spaces. So, and maybe you should have this set if it's not. So you really shouldn't have new white space on the end of your line. So you normally can't see that, but it's not good to have like some spaces or tabs at the end of a line. So if you check that, it should trim those. And here's the other thing. So if you're still having problems, you can actually make your white space visible like you can in Visual Studio, like you should be able to do in any good programming editor, okay, or IDE editor. So if you check that, it's a little bit busy, the display, but yeah, you can see these all now. So now you can see 2 spaces or dots here, and I'm not going to show, I'd have to uncheck my settings in order to insert some tabs in here, but if you had tabs, you'd see little arrows instead of spaces anywhere that those were being indented. So. And if you want to, if you can't get A-style working, I mean, you can just do a search and replace to search for any tab. So if you just go here and hit tab, and then here hit 2 spaces, and then do replace, it'll search, and you should set your cursor to the top of the file before you do your search. It should search if you have any tabs. Instead of saying not found, it'll find it and replace it with 2 spaces. Okay, so that's an easy, cheap way to just check and make certain all your embedded tabs are replaced with 2 spaces. the actual more powerful thing is to use this new A style here in Dev C++. So if you've got that working, the correct style settings for code for my class is you should use Almond bracket style. So this does many things, but among other things, it indents classes the way that I think they should be indented. So so you'll get class indentation like this by default. It's a little hard to see. Let me turn that off, that white space off here. There we go. So you'll get your classes indented like this. And you'll get your opening braces on a new line like this instead of at the end of a line, which is a common Java style, but it's more common to see opening braces at the on their own line correctly indented to the block level. And then the other setting, definitely this one though you need, so make certain that you use spaces for your indent style instead of tabs. And then set your tab width to 2, and that should be it. I mean, you don't really need to change any of those unless you want to. And then, if you do that, all you have to do is say do the format current style, and if anything is not formatted the correct way, it will reformat your file. Okay, so actually I was wrong on the style here. It did a little bit differently than I kind of like to have the private and public declarations at column 0. Let me see if I can fix that. I didn't notice that before. Although that's fine. I mean, if you leave it like that, I don't mind if those are indented too, and then each one that's private and public is then another indentation level under that. So maybe if I don't do that, yeah, so for me, I would prefer to uncheck the indent the classes there. But yeah, either way, that's one thing that I'm not going to specify as a class standard style, so you can do one or the other. Okay, so that's the basics of creating multi-file projects. If you're using some other IDE than Visual Studio or Dev C++, I mean, again, the concepts are the same, so you should be able to find that, in Xcode or whatever. But anyway, so that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.